Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Kelly and welcome to the Project Perfect MOOC sequence that looks at strategic procurement within the purchasing and supply management fundamentals. So this is a very brief presentation that covers some of the more detailed material in the MOOC itself, and it's really looking at how procurement and purchasing and supply management can move itself from more tactical and operational activities to those of a more strategic nature. So the learning goals for this particular sequence are critically discuss the strategic role of purchasing and supply management within organisations, apply a range of strategic purchasing tools and techniques for effective supplier management, and evaluate how a range of concepts, principles, theories and models can be used to develop an effective purchasing strategy. So in broad terms, this sequence looks at a number of different tools and models that can deliver increased value to an organisation as part of the purchasing processes that have been outlined in earlier sequences of this module and of this MOOC. And so it covers two very broad elements. So the first one looks at some concepts of linking to overall strategic aims. So this is where procurement and purchasing and supply management can move itself from more tactical activities to those that can deliver and add real value to an organisation. And then it covers a very brief overview of some specific tools and models underpinned by a category management approach. So the details in the slides contain links and contain additional materials, and so those can be looked at to go into the subject area in more depth. But the areas that we're going to look at are supply classification, supply market analysis, effective specification management, the supplier perspective and overall relationship management, and how the performance can be measured and managed of both the supplier and also the purchasing organisation itself. So in terms of linking to overall organisational strategy, what purchasing and supply management functions and individuals within those teams are trying to do is to make sure that they fit and their activities can add real value to what the organisation is trying to do at its overall corporate level. And this slide shows how that can link in very broad terms to overall organisational strategy. So starting with the corporate aims, so these are activities such as what businesses are we in, how should we allocate resources amongst those businesses, moving down towards individual business units, particularly if you're a part of a multinational or very large organisation, and how those can contribute to overall corporate strategy. And then looking at a functional level, so this is where purchasing and supply management and their role can really add value to the organisation, is making sure that they fit and contribute to the overall business strategy. Now, of course, that requires clear links and clear flows of information between the overall corporate, business units and functional strategies, so that individual measures, and when we look at those slightly later in this sequence, we look at what performance measures can be used both in measuring purchasing and supply management, but also the suppliers, because of course the reliance and ever increasing reliance on suppliers means that the products and services that they supply are critical for organisations to be able to provide their own products and services to their own customers. So when we think about the purchasing and supply management function, again, in very broad terms, we have some primary goals for those, and these will obviously depend on the type of organisation that is involved. So their main goals are ensuring that there is an uninterrupted supply of either raw materials, goods or services, depending on the type of organisation, but those that are being bought in at the lowest total cost. And so when we consider total cost, which has been covered in some of the other sequences, that isn't necessarily just about the unit price, it's the whole package, the whole life cycle of what's going on in that particular market. But it's also thinking about how quality can be improved and how quality of the goods and services that are being provided to our own organisation's customers can be improved, and also to make sure that customer satisfaction is optimised. So in markets now that are becoming increasingly fast, are becoming increasingly demanding from our customers, purchasing and supply management obviously plays a critical part in these particular activities. So when we think of those individual objectives, and this is where we start to see these flow through and go into the individual purchasing and supply management function performance measures, is that we're always looking to actively seek and source better materials, better services, more reliable suppliers, a greater degree of closer working with suppliers, a greater range and degree of partnerships. And when we look at supplier relationship management, we start to see where we might position suppliers within a spectrum of how they can be managed in terms of their relationship. and that we also ensure and involve suppliers and also individual and internal stakeholders in the development of new products and services to make sure that what is actually being bought, be that products or services, is what we as an organisation require and what our possibly diverse group of stakeholders requires. Now, in order to do that, then we've got a number of different tools that can be used, and these next slides cover some of those tools. Inevitably, the level of detail will be fairly brief at this stage, so what we've done on the slides is provide a lot of additional materials and additional links to allow you to go into those areas and look at those in more depth and to really consider those. And what we've done here is to also provide practical examples of where these have been used and deployed within practice, within industry, because purchasing and supply management is a very focused, very practice-based study area. So this is what we try to do here. So the first one is something that's used by a lot of organisations and does feature heavily in academic literature, is the CRIAC matrix. So this was developed in the early 1980s, which does seem quite a long time ago, but is still very much in use. And most organisations use this either implicitly or explicitly in terms of segmenting the supply base. So this is where we're looking at groups of suppliers in order to design effective strategies for dealing with those suppliers. And what CRIAC developed was this quadrant system, looking at two different variables. So the first one is positioning groups of suppliers according to their profit impact. So this is the volume that is purchased, the percentage of the total purchase cost, and the impact on the product quality or business, and that categorises those into one of two areas. And then also if we add on to supply risk, so this is when we consider the external supply market. So this is the availability, the number of suppliers, the competitive demand, our opportunities to either make the product ourselves or develop the service ourselves, or our need to buy it in from a supplier organisation. And in terms of the process of adopting CRIAC's matrix or a similar supplier segmentation matrix is looking at whether we position those, for example, as a strategic item. So that's in the top right-hand side of the quadrant. That's where it has a high profit impact and it has a high supply risk. So that suggests then, when we look at the market analysis, when we might use something like Porter's 5 forces or a more focused purchasing and supply management one, which I'm going to show on the next slide, and then we can position them accordingly and we can take actions. So in very broad terms, if we have a supplier or a supply category that is in the strategic items quadrant, this suggests that we need to develop closer relationships with that supplier, that we might need to invest more resources with that supplier, we might share more information with them, share risk, that type of thing. Whereas items that are in the non-critical, so they have low profit impact, low supply risk, we might adopt a different approach. So we might be, for example, more adversarial, more arm's length with those suppliers. And by way of example, we would see items such as stationery, for example, often featuring in the non-critical items, although that will of course depend on the type of organisation we are. So the next one we're going to look at, and this builds on an aspect of the CRIAC's matrix, is where we consider how we to analyse the supply market. So an area that we can look at is using something like Porter's 5 forces. And what I've done in this slide is to show some example for how this type of thing has been deployed in practice. So this slide actually shows something that's used by the Scottish government in terms of how they analyse their supply markets, but also provided an example from Australia, from the Queensland government. And what this does is it breaks it down into a number of different factors and how those considerations and guidelines can be used to consider and to lead into the type of actions that we need to take as part of our supply base and supply markets analysis. So some examples here are trade associations. So are there associations, for example, if it's in a particular market or in a particular industry sector that we might need to deal with, that we might need to collect information from? What are the trends and developments that are happening? So what's going to happen into the future? One of the ways that procurement and purchasing and supply management can add real value is being able to look at future trends and being able to deal with challenges now that may affect our organisation in 5 years, in 10 years' time, something like that. So if there's products that are becoming obsolete, or that there is going to be a scarcity of a particular either skill set or raw material. So the next area to look at, and this is very much about dealing with our internal stakeholders, is how do we manage specifications? Again, as per the previous slide, I put some practical examples here of where organisations have developed specifications and also types of specifications that have been developed. Because what a specification does is this provides an identification and an idea of what we as an organisation need. So the first stage of that is getting internal agreement of what the product, the services, or the mix of products and services are that we need. And again, this can be a very complex activity in areas that exhibit degrees or high degrees of technological complexity, of regulatory complexity. Those can be quite difficult to do. We might have a diverse group of stakeholders that actually require slightly different things. And what we use it for and what we need to do is to take a proactive approach from a purchasing and supply management point of view, and to make sure that we actively engage with our internal stakeholders to make sure that what we're actually going to the supply market is what we actually require and what we need, rather than what individual stakeholders want, which may allow or may mean that there is over specification. So we're buying products or services or features that we don't actually need. So that means that we need to be proactive with this, in that we need to provide information, we need to identify potential risk, because if specifications are unchallenged, then they can, for example, limit competition. They can make specifications over-engineered, so with additional features that we don't need. And this is an area that purchasing and supply management can provide real value within an organisation in making sure that there is a consistency of approach in developing specifications, and that actually those documents that when we go out to the market and we go out to the supply market, that form the basis of our invitation to tenders, our request for quotations, are viewable and are usable by suppliers to provide a response that allows us to compare and contrast the different offerings from particular suppliers, and that also that then these form the basis of our contracts and our legal relationships with the suppliers. So a critical area for purchasing and supply management to develop their real strategic value. The next area is measuring supply performance. So if we see these as more of part of the individual purchasing process, is that once we've engaged a supplier, that we've got the specification in place. And again, this is where the clarity at the early stage of the process really helps us, is that we're able to measure the supply performance. And most organisations will tend to measure it according to some similar criteria. So there will be things like quality, cost, timeliness, the quantity that's being delivered, the compliance to corporate policies and procedures. So some of these areas started to become more important, particularly around compliance, particularly around corporate social responsibility, that organisations need to make sure that they can demonstrate transparency within the supply chain, particularly in certain sectors and certain markets that they require, because their customers are requiring those. And so if you think of the dependency that organisations now have on their supply chains, we think of in the food industry, in the clothing and the apparel industry, that there are real questions being asked from customers and end consumers about where does my product come from, what's the process that it's been developed, and the ways that we do that is to make sure that we have a robust supplier performance measurement system. But there's no doubt that we can't get away from some of the more traditional areas that purchasing and supply management would be involved in. So it's things like cost, for example, and quality, to make sure that those fit with the overall objectives of the organisation. An area that is becoming increasingly important is how do we measure the performance of the purchasing and supply management department itself. So one area that we can focus on is obviously how do our suppliers perform, but also when we look at how the function itself performs. And what we started to see is a shift away from some of those more traditional transactional and operational measures. For example, how many purchase orders have we placed in a particular time frame, to those that are more sophisticated and those that are going to add more value. So it's areas around the purchasing staff and organisation. So it's training and motivation, for example. It's around how do we engage with our internal stakeholders, how involved are we with our suppliers, and the early supplier involvement that we might have. So this is an area that organisations are consistently trying to develop, is that how do they strategically position their own performance metrics. So we start to see the use, for example, of the balanced scorecard that fits within purchasing organisations, but also has a flow and has a link and integration to the overall objectives of the organisation. So the next area is something really to consider and underpins some of the other areas, and it fits with this idea that suppliers are becoming more partners in the activities that we're involving, and also that they have certain perceptions of us. And this is particularly important in some markets where there might be a great degree of supplier power, so a smaller number of dominant suppliers. Maybe ourselves, we are a smaller purchasing organisation, we're a smaller organisation. So this is an interesting way of considering that, and this is looking at the supplier's perspective, and this can be linked with tools such as the CRITE matrix. And this looks at, if we are a supplier, how do we think and how do we perceive the buying organisation? So we have on the y-axis the attractiveness of the customer. So this can be around whether the organisation pays on time, whether it has a good reputation in the market, for example, whether they are easy to deal with, whether they provide information to us in a timely, accurate and quality manner. And then on the x-axis we have the relative value of the account. So this is how much the organisation is spending relative to some of our other customers. And so what we don't want to see is to see a mismatch between our perceptions of a supplying organisation and their perceptions of us. So for example, if we are positioned within the lower left-hand quadrant, which is a nuisance customer, this is where we are not particularly attractive. Maybe we don't pay on time, maybe we're very late with our purchase orders, that we expect deliveries too soon or in unrealistic timescales, and also relative to the other customers of that supplier, we don't spend a great deal of money. And again, this is where we find if we're dealing with a very large supplier, even though we might think we are spending a lot of money compared to their other suppliers, that we're not spending a great deal. Now there's possibilities to move ourselves within those different variables. So we might start to collate spend together, to amalgamate spend. This might allow us to spend more with an individual supplier. Or similarly, we might try and make ourselves more attractive, to move ourselves up to a quadrant, because what this will mean is that the supplier may well expend more resources in dealing with us. It may mean that they take a more proactive approach in dealing with us. So there's ways that we can influence that. Maybe it's in ensuring that our purchase orders adopt a standard format, that our information is timely, that we start to pay on time. So some of these things are more within our control as a purchasing and supply management organisation. The final tool to look at is about supplier relationships. So this is at the end of the supplier management spectrum in terms of processes, and this is about choosing the right type of relationship. So if we link back to the CRITE matrix and we consider those suppliers that are in the strategic quadrant, this suggests to us that we want a relationship that is closer, that is further towards the right-hand side of this spectrum. And this means that we might share greater degrees of information with them, that we might be more open with them, that we might share our plans for the future more with them. Whereas those suppliers that are at the left-hand side, so those that are adversarial, those that are more arm's length, so we think of product areas or service areas such as stationery, for example. There's a lot of suppliers that can provide our product. If we don't get our pencils on a particular day, we can probably survive as an organisation, depending on, obviously, what type of organisation we are. And it's not to say that those types of relationships are intrinsically better or worse than any others, because those on the left-hand side, so those that are more adversarial and arm's length, require less expenditure of resources for us, but they need to be right for the scenario. And the important thing is that we make sure that we're monitoring these on an ongoing basis and ensuring that we've got the right type of relationship depending on the supplier and depending on some of the supply market forces that we've got. Some areas to cover that are going to influence and that are going to ensure that we react and proactively deal with some of the future challenges, and this very much comes out of the research of the Perfect project itself, and the website is on the slides that you can look at. So these are some future trends that we expect to see that are going to influence and change the way that we do things. So a greater use of automation and technology, for example. So this is going to mean that there's going to be less reliance and less expectation of operational activities within purchasing, so that we need to make sure that we've moved towards and started to use some of the strategic tools that we've covered as part of this sequence, but also that those skills that are required of modern and future purchasing and supply management professionals are going to require more strategic elements. So areas such as entrepreneurship, creativity, an ability to network, to set up and to have established networks, both with buyers in other organisations, within our own organisations, and also within our own supply network as well. The final slide contains some references and further reading. So I've obviously put all the references that were in the sequence itself, and also some future reading. What I've done here is to provide some practice-based elements. So there's one from SIPS, which is the UK Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, which is looking at particularly around strategic skills and competencies, and also one from the World Health Organization is showing how they have shifted from a more passive, a more transactional, a more operational purchasing and supply management function to that of a far more strategic nature. I hope you find this useful, and thank you very much for listening.